On a December night, the desert storm raged, and the hangar cameras showed emptiness. 9 discs gone, yet the sensors still registered 320 tons. In the logs, only blank lines remained, proof that disappearance did not mean absence. Nevada in the year 1989 carried with it the silence of a scorched world. The desert stretched outward in all directions, a vast expanse of dust and stone where the horizon dissolved into heat and distance. The ground was dry and fractured, as though the earth had been set on fire centuries earlier and never cooled. Low ridges of weathered rock rose like the spine of a buried animal, and between them, sparse bushes clung stubbornly to life, their roots clawing into the mineral soil. Dust storms often came unannounced, spreading like pale curtains across the land, filling the lungs with grit and coating every surface with a film of ochre powder. On a map, the place appeared empty, a blank region where cartographers had written nothing at all, as if the land were unworthy of detail. Yet the emptiness was an illusion. Behind concrete barriers and weathered fences of barbed wire, there existed a series of structures that the official charts never acknowledged. They were hangars without windows, immense shells of steel that reflected the sun in the daytime until their surfaces gleamed like molten mirrors. At night, they vanished almost entirely, blending with the surrounding darkness so that only the faint outline of their roofs betrayed their presence. The perimeter was marked by signs every few hundred yards. The lettering was blunt and efficient, warning against trespassing, forbidding photography, and reminding that lethal force was authorized. Few ever approached close enough to test the threat. The land itself discouraged curiosity. There was nothing welcoming in the broken stones, the dry ravines, or the metallic hum of distant transformers. Those who drove near often described a sense of being observed, as though the desert itself had grown eyes. Entry required more than a gate and a key. A system of passes had been established with mechanical precision. Each worker carried a plastic card with a magnetic stripe, the surface scuffed from constant use. To present it at a scanner was to hear the soft click of relays and the flash of a green light. To forget it was to be denied completely, left to wait under the sun until clearance could be confirmed. Beyond the gates, cameras watched with a constant red glow, small glass eyes that never blinked. Every corner of the installation was covered, and the images were fed silently into archives no outsider would ever see. Inside the fences, the atmosphere changed. The heat of the desert was replaced by a sterile dryness, as though the air had been filtered of all impurities, even scent itself. The corridors resembled those of a hospital, with walls painted in pale colors that absorbed sound until footsteps seemed distant. Ventilation systems moved air with a low mechanical sigh. In every hallway, signs hung at precise intervals, bearing a single word: restricted. The warning applied not only to space, but to thought, a reminder that entry came with a cost that extended beyond employment. New personnel often required weeks to adapt. Before being allowed into the restricted zones, they underwent examinations that were more invasive than ordinary medical checks. Blood was taken, vision measured, reflexes tested. Electrodes recorded heart rhythms, and technicians observed every fluctuation with impassive attention. Psychological assessments were conducted in cold rooms under fluorescent lights, questions delivered in monotone voices until the answers blurred together. Past histories were dissected as if the applicants were specimens rather than individuals. Every school attended, every job held, every minor infraction was recorded and reconsidered. Those who passed through these procedures crossed an invisible threshold. The act of entering was less a beginning of work and more the abandonment of a prior identity. A man who stepped through the gate in the morning emerged inside stripped of past affiliations, of ordinary habits, even of his own certainty. It was as though the desert consumed the outer self, leaving behind only a body that obeyed orders. The emptiness of the land outside mirrored the emptiness demanded within. Some spoke of the silence that followed them long after departure. The corridors echoed faintly, yet the echoes never belonged to the person who made them. Workers described the sensation of being watched not only by cameras but by something less tangible, a constant awareness pressing at the edges of their perception. Sleep became difficult. Memories grew indistinct, as if blurred by the same filters that cleansed the air. In time, they stopped questioning the feeling, for the rules made no allowance for hesitation. The journals kept at the entry point were meticulous, pages filled with names, times, and codes. Every individual was recorded with precision, leaving behind a trail of ink that seemed more permanent than the bodies themselves. Yet on the 20th of November, an anomaly appeared. Between two neatly written names there lay an empty space, a blank line without signature or number. The system accepted it as valid, granting access as if the absence itself carried authority. Guards noted the strangeness in silence, their pens hovering over the page before moving on. No correction was made. The blank entry remained, standing out like a scar in an otherwise perfect record. The desert beyond remained indifferent. Winds rose and fell, carrying dust over the concrete walls, burying the barbed wire in pale drifts. The sun marked its course, rising with brutal clarity and sinking into skies of copper and violet. Night animals stirred among the rocks, their movements faint against the vast silence. Yet behind the fences, the hangars held their shadows, and inside the records, a gap waited, a void as undeniable as it was unexplained. The emptiness of that line lingered, more unsettling than any signature could have been. It was a space that suggested presence through absence, a reminder that in this landscape of silence and secrecy, even nothingness could open a door. Beneath the surface of the desert lay a structure that few ever entered and even fewer understood. The underground vaults were known among staff as the glass archives, though no actual glass was present. The term arose from the way light fractured across the walls. Panels of polished composite reflected with a brightness so intense that they resembled frozen ice. Every corridor glimmered faintly, creating the illusion of transparency, as if the walls might dissolve at any moment and reveal something waiting behind them. There were no windows here, no suggestion of an outside world. The air was dry, conditioned to remove every trace of scent, carrying only the faint buzz of electricity from hidden circuits. Rows of fluorescent lamps ran overhead, evenly spaced, their glow unchanging across the hours. It was difficult to know the time in such a place. Morning and evening were erased, leaving only an endless present defined by light that neither dimmed nor warmed. The ceiling was low, forcing each movement to feel deliberate, as if the architecture itself discouraged haste. Cabinets lined the halls, each one identical to the next. They were steel frames painted in pale enamel, with doors that opened only through magnetic keys. Inside lay folders bound with dull gray covers. The folders contained sheets of paper covered in sequences of numbers, sets of coordinates, diagrams drawn in careful lines. Some resembled turbine schematics, others recalled anatomical sketches, yet none were labeled with ordinary names. Instead, each page bore a stamped code, combinations of letters and digits that suggested cataloging systems far older than the building itself. Every page was numbered, the order precise. Yet anomalies revealed themselves to those who turned the pages carefully. After page 212 came page 214, the absence acknowledged by no one. Missing numbers occurred irregularly, as if entire fragments had been deliberately removed. The gaps were always ignored. The workers in white coats moved with studied composure, filing papers, making notes, never pausing to ask why the sequence faltered. Those who once had asked were remembered briefly, before disappearing into transfers that were never explained. Sometimes their names vanished from the rosters as if they had never been employed at all. Among the cabinets stood rooms divided by reflective partitions. These were the true glass spaces, chambers that refracted the light until objects within seemed suspended in a haze. The surfaces were polished to the degree that a person standing inside could see his own reflection layered endlessly, faces overlapping until the features blurred into anonymity. No sound echoed in these rooms. Words spoken aloud were swallowed as though the air itself rejected them. The only evidence of presence was the rustle of paper or the soft scrape of shoes against the smooth floor. In one such chamber, placed on a pedestal of reinforced steel, rested a metallic sphere. It was smaller than a football, its surface seamless and cold to the touch. Workers rarely approached it without gloves, for its chill seemed unnatural, deeper than metal drawn from the earth. The official documents identified it simply as Element 115. The description was clinical, yet the private annotations carried a different weight. They spoke of distortions measured around the object, of fields bending instruments, of cameras refusing to capture its form. Photographs developed into blurred images where the sphere appeared only as a smear of light, its edges dissolving like vapor. The files noted that attempts to measure the sphere's mass produced conflicting results. On one scale, it appeared impossibly heavy, as if containing the weight of something larger than itself. On another, it registered nearly weightless, no more substantial than air. Repeated trials yielded no consistency. The numbers shifted with each attempt, as though the object resisted the act of being known. Reports described compasses turning without cause, watches slowing by seconds when placed nearby, and electronic devices shutting down in its presence. Security protocols demanded constant monitoring. Cameras were mounted in every corner, capturing still frames at fixed intervals, yet the images themselves betrayed anomalies. Where the pedestal should have appeared empty save for the sphere, shapes sometimes intruded. In one photograph, a shadow stretched across the wall, though no person had entered. In another, an outline of a human figure was visible in the corner of the frame, blurred but undeniable. The log of that day recorded no visitors, no personnel assigned to the chamber. The signature remained unexplained, a fragment captured by machinery incapable of imagination. The researchers avoided discussing these images. They were filed under routine anomalies and stored alongside thousands of other documents. Yet those who had examined them carried the impression silently. It lingered in their movements, the way they glanced into the corners of rooms, the way they avoided looking directly at reflective surfaces. Something about the archives seemed to hold more than paper and steel. The reflections on the walls suggested the presence of layers unseen, as if each step taken echoed not only in space, but in time. The sphere remained at the center of this quiet unease. It did not move, it did not change, yet its stillness seemed more threatening than motion. Visitors described the sensation of pressure when standing near it, not against the skin, but against thought itself, as if the mind bent slightly around its presence. Long exposure to the chamber left workers drained, eyes burning, memories uncertain. Some later struggled to recall the details of their shifts, their recollections interrupted by blank intervals where time seemed to dissolve. No explanation was given. No reassurance was offered. The silence of the archives persisted, bright and sterile, filled with documents that recorded but never revealed. Yet the photographs with the blurred figure continued to exist, filed away with all the rest, a reminder that even in a place built to preserve certainty, shadows still intruded. The blank spaces in page numbers, the missing personnel, The distorted images, each was small in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that suggested the archives themselves were less a repository of knowledge and more a veil, a glass surface reflecting only fragments of what lay beneath. And in the corner of one photograph, beneath fluorescent light that never flickered, a silhouette remained. It had no name, no record, no clearance, but it was there nonetheless, standing quietly where no one was supposed to be. The hangar revealed itself only at night, though not through sound or movement. It emerged through presence, a vast chamber buried beneath the desert, where silence pressed against the ears until it seemed louder than any machine. The walls were ribbed with steel, reinforced by beams sunk deep into the earth, yet the scale of the space defied engineering logic. It stretched wider and higher than the blueprints suggested, as if geometry itself had been bent to contain its contents. The air inside was always cool, filtered to sterility, carrying the faint scent of ozone as though storms lingered just beyond the walls. At the center of the chamber rested 9 objects. They were aligned in deliberate formation, each equidistant from the others, forming a pattern that mirrored no human design. The structures were discs, their surfaces flawless and continuous, as if carved from solid masses of dark metal. No rivets, no seams, no hinges betrayed their construction. In the dim light, they resembled fragments of the night sky, cut free and anchored to the ground. Each disc stood upon supports like landing struts, though the struts themselves seemed grown rather than manufactured. They merged seamlessly with the hull, no joints visible. The surfaces reflected the glow of the lamps in ways that unsettled the eye, bending light until the edges blurred. At times, the reflections created the illusion that the discs were transparent, as if the metal were only a skin stretched across emptiness. Cranes positioned along the hangar ceiling lowered their hooks with slow precision. When one of the discs was moved, the machinery strained in silence, as if the object carried not weight but resistance of another kind. The operators moved carefully, shifting each craft only inches at a time. There was always the impression that crossing an unseen boundary could trigger an effect none of them were prepared to face. The fear was never spoken aloud, but it lived in the tightness of shoulders and the way eyes flickered toward the emergency exits. Teams were divided with strict separation. One group studied external composition, another explored the interiors, while a third analyzed the suspected propulsion systems. No information was shared across groups without clearance. Workers passed one another in the corridors without acknowledgement, carrying sealed folders as though even a glance could betray forbidden knowledge. The outer shells defied classification. When touched, the surfaces radiated a subtle warmth, gentle enough to resemble living skin. Yet instruments placed against the same area registered temperatures below freezing. Thermal cameras produced distorted images, blocks of white noise rather than measurable readings. The inconsistency became a recurring notation in the logs, repeated so often that it was eventually reduced to a code. Thermal inversion unresolved. Attempts at chemical analysis failed. Samples scraped from the hull dissolved into nothing before reaching laboratories, leaving only empty containers. Spectral tests performed in situ produced contradictory results, registering alloys that should not coexist in the same sample. One report concluded that the material behaved less like metal and more like a variable state, shifting properties in response to observation. The note was later crossed out in red ink, replaced with a statement of inconclusive. Inside the discs, the strangeness deepened. Compartments were smooth and featureless, walls curving with organic precision, surfaces free of screws, wires, or welds. The spaces seemed designed for beings of smaller stature. Chairs, if they could be called that, were set low to the ground, their proportions suggesting occupants no taller than 4 feet. Instrument panels were absent. Instead, subtle depressions in the surface hinted at controls beyond human comprehension. Lighting within the interiors originated from nowhere. The walls emitted a faint glow when occupied, but returned to darkness when vacated. Instruments detected no power sources, no circuits, no heat emissions. The glow existed and then ceased, leaving behind no trace of its origin. Researchers wrote descriptions with mechanical detachment, but the unease showed in the way their pens pressed grooves into the paper. The propulsion sections drew the most attention. 3 hemispherical cavities were aligned beneath each disc, their symmetry flawless. In some models, the cavities contained crystalline structures arranged in triangular patterns. In others, the spaces were empty yet resonant, as if vibrating with frequencies outside human hearing. Workers reported sensations of vertigo when standing too close, describing the floor as tilting, though instruments recorded no movement. Every report referred to the objects as transportation vehicles of unknown origin. The word extraterrestrial was never printed, yet the implication saturated the text. When logs described acceleration rates beyond any human craft, or silent hovering without exhaust, the writers left spaces between sentences, as though silence itself carried the weight of forbidden admission. The hangar operated under perpetual light. The lamps never dimmed, and the discs cast shadows that shifted unnaturally, sliding across the floor without clear relation to the source. Workers avoided eye contact during long shifts, their gazes fixed on instruments or the floor. The presence of the discs created a pressure, a quiet reminder that they did not belong in the world that studied them. Then one detail emerged that unsettled even the most disciplined staff. During routine inspection of the 7th disc, a mark was observed along its hull. At first it appeared as a reflection, a glint of light distorted by the curved surface. Upon closer examination, it revealed itself as a scratch, shallow but deliberate, etched into the otherwise seamless metal. Instruments confirmed it was not the result of accidental contact. The depth and angle of the incision suggested a tool, but not one known to the engineers. The mark was finer than diamond, cleaner than laser, cut into the surface without residue. No record existed of any incident that could have caused it. The scratch remained, small yet undeniable, a rupture in the illusion of perfection. Workers photographed it repeatedly, yet the images blurred as if the mark refused capture. In the reports, it was listed as anomaly, yet whispers followed the discovery. If the craft were untouched relics, who had marked them? And if they were constructed elsewhere, where did such tools exist? The hangar remained quiet, the discs unmoving, the lights unchanging. Yet the single line carved into the 7th disc carried more weight than all the missing pages and silent anomalies. It was proof that the objects had been touched, altered, perhaps even opposed. A scar left not by accident but by intention. A reminder that the unknown was not untouched. Beyond a reinforced door sealed with 3 layers of clearance protocols and monitored by guards who never spoke, lay a chamber unlike the others. The space was colder than the hangars above, not only in temperature, but in atmosphere. The air smelled faintly of formalin, antiseptic alcohol, and chilled metal. It carried the sterile bite of a morgue mixed with the quiet hum of refrigeration units, working endlessly beneath the floor. Each step echoed sharply, the sound stripped of warmth, as if the walls themselves consumed any trace of human presence. Rows of transparent containers stretched across the room. They were cylindrical, constructed of thick, reinforced glass, each secured by bands of steel that clamped them into the floor. Inside the vessels floated a translucent solution, viscous and slightly murky, the color shifting between pale amber and smoky gray depending on the angle of light. Within that liquid rested silhouettes that were neither fully human nor fully machine, blurred forms suspended as if caught between definition and decay. The records filed by the supervising division referred to the contents only as specimens. The term was deliberately neutral, designed to strip away associations, but no observer could escape the implication of bodies. They were small, measuring little more than 120 centimeters from head to toe. Their proportions were irregular. Limbs appeared elongated, arms stretching nearly to the knees, fingers tapering to points that seemed too delicate to support weight. The torsos were narrow, rib cages visible as faint ridges beneath the pallid skin. Their heads were the most striking. Oversized compared to their bodies, smooth domes without hair, their faces marked by hollows where eyes should have been. No pupils, no sclera, only dark voids recessed deep into the skulls. The absence of expression gave them the appearance of sketches unfinished, forms that seemed more like drafts than complete organisms. Mouths, if present, were mere slits, thin and unbroken. No nose protruded, only subtle depressions above the hollow sockets. The surfaces of their skin resisted classification. Under lamplight, the flesh glistened faintly, too smooth for human texture, yet not reflective like metal. When touched during examinations, technicians described it as pliant but with an undercurrent of resistance, as though pressing against a membrane stretched over something denser. Medical teams approached the analysis with procedures developed for autopsy, yet found those methods inadequate. Standard tissue samples dissolved when removed from solution, collapsing into unrecognizable matter before reaching microscopes. DNA sequencing produced no coherent chains. Machines designed to chart human genomes returned only static noise or sequences that repeated without end. In several cases, the instruments crashed entirely, screens freezing as if refusing to process the input. Physicians who handled the examinations recorded physical reactions of their own. Several reported sudden dizziness, disorientation, and in more severe cases, metallic tastes spreading across the tongue without clear cause. One entry noted bleeding gums after extended proximity, though no chemical explanation was given. Others described a sensation of vibration through the fingertips when gloved hands brushed against the glass of the containers, as though some field radiated outward from the preserved forms. The documentation grew contradictory. In some logs, the specimens were noted as lifeless remnants, inert structures preserved in solution. In others, subtle movements were recorded, so faint they could have been illusions. Technicians swore that a finger had twitched, that shadows inside a ribcage shifted as if mimicking breath. Supervisors dismissed these reports as stress-induced perception, yet the notations remained, circled in red ink with instructions not to disseminate further. Lighting in the section intensified the unease. Fluorescent panels emitted a harsh, unwavering glow that reflected against the glass cylinders. The liquid inside refracted the beams, splitting the room into fragmented patterns of light and shadow. At times, the silhouettes inside seemed multiplied, as though more than one figure resided in a single container. Movement of staff around the room created distortions that gave the impression of forms stirring, watching, leaning closer. In a far corner of the section stood a container unlike the rest. Its glass bore scratches along the inner surface, faint lines etched into the condensation as if something had pressed outward from within. The marks formed no symbols, yet their placement suggested intention rather than random stress. No record existed of how they had been made. Inventory lists detailed each container with clinical precision. Columned entries gave numbers, measurements, and condition reports. Yet within one logbook, a discrepancy appeared. Between two consecutive specimen numbers, a blank entry was written. Where other records listed status as preserved, damaged, or partial, this space held nothing. It was an omission surrounded by order, and in such an environment, absence carried as much meaning as presence. During later inspections, the blank entry grew more disturbing. The container associated with that line stood in place, but it was empty. No silhouette floated inside, only the murky solution swirling faintly under the vibration of the refrigeration units. At first, it was assumed the vessel had never been filled, that the omission reflected an unused designation. Yet technicians noted traces inconsistent with that explanation. Condensation streaked the inner surface of the glass. Patterns of moisture clung in ways suggesting recent disturbance. The streaks ran downward as though something had been removed only hours earlier. The steel clamps securing the container showed subtle shifts, as if tightened again after being released. None of these signs were marked in official reports, but staff whispered among themselves during rotations. The unease thickened in silence. The biological section remained sealed behind its triple clearance door, the lights never dimming, the refrigeration units humming without pause. Yet among the dozens of transparent cylinders, one stood as an absence, its liquid unsettled, its glass marked with the ghosts of what might once have been inside. The hook remained undeniable. Somewhere in the files, a blank entry stood between lines of order, unacknowledged but real. And in the chamber, behind glass cold with condensation, the evidence suggested that something had been there. Something now gone. Secrecy within the compound was not enforced by walls or gates alone, but by a carefully cultivated fear. Every worker understood that his movements were captured from multiple angles, his words filtered through microphones embedded in ceilings and walls, his biometric data logged each time he touched a door handle or inserted his access card into a reader. Surveillance was constant, so pervasive that it felt less like observation and more like inhabiting a cage woven from invisible threads. People rarely spoke above a murmur, and even casual remarks carried the stiffness of self-censorship. It was the weight of knowing that silence itself was the safest language, yet fear, like any structure, could fracture. Over time, the burden of silence pressed too heavily, and a few cracks began to spread through the system. Some employees turned to anonymous letters, typed without signatures and mailed from distant towns. They were vague, hints rather than confessions, fragments of technical language disguised within ordinary sentences. Others slipped clues into early computer forums, embedding phrases about reactors and propulsion into discussions of science fiction, as if testing whether strangers would notice. None of these hints carried enough detail to confirm anything, but together they formed a faint pulse of unrest, a quiet rebellion against the sealed corridors. Within the compound itself, rumors spread with the persistence of sand carried by desert wind. Operators whispered about cameras that displayed corridors where no one stood, only to later show outlines of people lingering in the same space. Reports circulated of audio channels opening without command, flooding headsets with bursts of static that sometimes carried faint patterns, like words spoken in a language too quick to follow. The incident logs grew heavier with entries written in the most restrained style. Terms like spontaneous activation, unexplained noise, and distortion appeared again and again. Each notation was clinical, but the accumulation of them hinted at a system unraveling from within. Supervisors dismissed these events as technical malfunctions, blaming electrical surges or environmental interference. But those who witnessed the anomalies in real time carried a different conviction. They described chills rising unbidden, the sensation of being observed not by the cameras but through them, as if the machines had become conduits for something unseen. The more they tried to ignore the incidents, the more frequent they seemed to grow, embedding unease into the rhythm of daily operations. By the middle of November, the sense of instability was no longer limited to whispers. Several staff members noted that doors opened half a second before keycards were swiped, as if the system anticipated their movements. Others reported screens that displayed their names attached to assignments they had not been given. A climate of mistrust deepened. Workers began to suspect not only the supervisors, but the very infrastructure surrounding them. Then, late in the month, the structure cracked further. One engineer, a man who had served without incident for years, failed to report for his scheduled shift. At first, his absence seemed like an oversight, a rare failure in punctuality. His superiors checked his assigned quarters and found his belongings intact. His clothing lay folded in a drawer. His watch rested on a desk beside a notepad filled with neat calculations. Most unsettling was his keycard, left in plain sight on the surface of the table. As though abandoned deliberately, security systems showed no record of his departure. Sensors indicated that his biometric profile remained within the facility. According to the automated logs, he was still present, moving through restricted areas at intervals, yet no one saw him. Roll calls returned his name unanswered. Surveillance cameras never displayed his face. His absence became a paradox. A man missing in body but still registered as present by the machines. Investigators combed the facility in silence. Teams moved through the hangars, the archives, and the biological section, checking every corner, every chamber. They found no trace beyond the belongings left behind. No fingerprints marked the walls. No footprints disturbed the dust in service tunnels. It was as if he had dissolved into the structure itself. By the 28th of November, the case reached the desks of the highest security officers. A special entry was added to the incident report. It stated that at 3:12 in the morning, the subject was recorded as leaving the territory. The language was terse and absolute. The system had logged an exit at that precise time, yet the physical evidence contradicted it completely. The barrier gate, heavy with hydraulics and reinforced steel, had not opened once that night. No vehicle had passed, no pedestrian clearance was granted. The external sensors remained blank. The contradiction unsettled even the most disciplined officers. How could a system so redundant declare a departure when no mechanism had been triggered? The anomaly was noted in bold, sealed with signatures of multiple supervisors. The file was classified at once, restricted beyond ordinary clearance, and discussions of it were forbidden. But among the staff, the knowledge spread in murmurs. They did not need to see the report to sense its weight. The absence of the engineer hung over them like a warning written in the architecture itself. The compound carried on as if nothing had changed. Shifts rotated, experiments resumed, logs continued to be filled. Yet each worker who passed the abandoned quarters felt the pull of the missing presence. Fear, once the tool of control, now turned inward. It was no longer only the fear of being watched, but the fear of disappearing while still recorded as present, of becoming a blank entry in a system that did not recognize absence. The hook remained sharp. The record showed an exit at 3:12 in the morning. The gate had never opened. The engineer had vanished without leaving the facility, his body unaccounted for, his presence both affirmed and denied by the machines that defined reality inside the desert compound. The month of December settled over Nevada with a weight of silence broken only by the wind. On one particular night, that silence fractured into something more. A storm rose suddenly from the horizon, carrying dust in waves that swept across the desert floor. The air thickened with particles until visibility shrank to almost nothing. Electric charges built within the storm, turning the atmosphere brittle. Sand scratched against windows and walls like static made physical. The compound, usually an island of control, became enveloped in a darkness punctuated by amber flashes from distant lightning. Inside the facility, radar operators noted unusual returns. Their screens lit with arcs and points that suggested movement high above the storm clouds. Objects appeared, vanished, and reappeared in positions too erratic for ordinary aircraft. The logs registered them one after another, each tagged with timestamps that grew shorter between entries. The operators filed the data into restricted channels, and within moments the files were sealed from their own access. Only the notation remained: aerial anomalies observed, all content classified. Meanwhile, the internal surveillance system behaved as if caught in the storm itself. Cameras mounted within the hangars flickered, their feeds cutting in and out. When the images stabilized, they displayed bursts of light striking the metallic structures inside. These were not reflections of lightning from outside, but sharp flares that seemed to originate within the chambers themselves. For seconds at a time, hangar walls glowed as though illuminated by invisible arcs of electricity. The lights snapped on and off like silent lightning, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally against the smooth curves of the stored craft. In the communications wing, receivers caught something unexpected. At 3 minutes past 2 in the morning, a burst appeared on the spectrum at 3.2 gigahertz. The signal lasted only a handful of seconds, but its composition defied ordinary classification. Analysts described its shape as resembling the cadence of human speech, waves patterned with rhythm and interval. Yet, when examined more closely, the phonetic structure collapsed into incomprehensibility. It carried intonation, rise and fall, pause and return, but no language recognized by any algorithm. When the playback was slowed, the sound resembled fragments of syllables. When accelerated, it became a tone that climbed beyond audible range. The technicians preserved the signal as protocol demanded. The file was logged under the category Unknown Transmission and locked into the archives. Attempts to replicate the event failed. No further bursts appeared at that frequency, nor did any associated noise remain on the spectrum. Within seconds, the airwaves returned to silence as absolute as the desert after a storm. The facility continued under routine, but the traces of the night remained. Within the archives, pages once filled with notations now bore blank lines where entries had been scrubbed. Photographs developed from surveillance footage showed blurred silhouettes instead of defined objects, as though the emulsion itself had resisted imprinting the truth. Some reports arrived unsigned, their last pages ending abruptly without conclusion. The documents bore the appearance of order, but a closer reading revealed absences threaded through them like gaps in memory. Personnel moved as though nothing had shifted. They carried out maintenance, logged times, and entered laboratories with the same precision as before. Yet an unspoken awareness spread, a recognition that something had changed beneath the surface. Every file bore faint evidence of disappearance, whether in the missing words, the distorted images, or the signatures that never appeared. The compound maintained its rhythm, but that rhythm carried an undercurrent of fracture. Then came the final discovery. In the days following the storm, a routine review of internal camera systems was conducted. Among the reels of static and broken frames, one clear image surfaced. It displayed the interior of the main hangar. The view was fixed, illuminated by the harsh light of mounted lamps, but the space appeared wrong. Where 9 metallic discs had once stood in arranged silence, there was now only emptiness. The hangar floor stretched bare from wall to wall. The machines, so immense and immovable, were absent as though they had never existed. Sensor data added to the contradiction. Instruments calibrated to measure load and pressure indicated mass still present within the hangar. The numbers were precise: 320 tons distributed across the floor. The readings confirmed weight where no object could be seen. Cameras showed emptiness, yet the ground beneath bore the strain of something immense pressing down upon it. The inconsistency was documented with care, then sealed away. In the official files, the entry appeared only as anomalous discrepancy, pending further review. But for those who glimpsed the image before it vanished into classification, the message was unmistakable. The hangar was empty to the eye, yet its silence carried the burden of invisible mass. The last signal, brief as it was, lingered in the minds of those who recorded it. It had spoken in a cadence too close to language to be dismissed, and it had come in the precise hours when the hangars filled with light. Together, the events formed a pattern that the archives could not erase. A storm, a signal, an absence, and a weight still pressing down on the desert floor. The hook lay unresolved. 9 objects were gone. The hangar appeared empty, but the earth itself measured their presence. 320 tons that could not be seen. A final reminder that disappearance was not the same as absence.